Thank you.
Then he works together at sea.
Yeah, and the church put me on the board too, right in the middle of a pastor's search, which is great fun, let me tell you. You know, just in case you didn't know, Together at Sea used to be called the South Carolina Association of Nonprofit Organizations, so or SCANPO, and so we're kind of like a chamber of commerce, but for nonprofits, and we do learning, leading, and advocacy for the nonprofit sector. I like to say the best part of my job and what we do at Together at Sea is we bring nonprofit leaders together so that they can learn from each other. You know, when a nonprofit leader in one part of the state calls and says, "Hey, I'm looking for such and such and so, and I can point to somebody else clear on the other side of the state and say, you need to talk to them," then I have done my job and I feel really good about it. And then presentations like these where I get to say, here's how nonprofits actually work, because there's a lot of misconceptions out there. Now I know y'all folks in library folks know more than everybody else. It's where all the information goes, right? And so I know we won't have any misconceptions here, but just in case, I'm going to go over a few. This is a presentation I've been doing for a number of years called Before You Start a Nonprofit. Now, many of y'all may be saying to yourself, Ben, we're past that point. We've already done the thing, but just in case, oh, I forgot to mention, I'm sorry, I'm a little scatterbrained this morning. I was a volunteer at a library when I was a kid. When I was in elementary school, I volunteered at the school library for elementary school, middle school, high school. I volunteered in my Gaston branch library. And so I always loved the libraries. And so when Friends of South Carolina Libraries reached out to me and it's like, hey, can you get a presentation for us? I was like, gladly. So that's a little bit about me. Let me ask you some questions about y'all, if y'all don't mind taking the time to do some introductions. If you don't mind telling me your name, which library or friends group that you're with, and is your friends group incorporated? Or are you more unofficial at this stage? Or are you maybe just thinking about starting a friends group? Where are you in this process? That'll help me tailor the presentation and not focus on the things that y'all have already done. Can I start over here at this end?
I am affiliated with the Richland County Friends Foundation. It's a well-established organization.
Indeed, indeed.
My background is that I'm a friend of Richland Friends and Foundation. I have to always stop and think how to say that. But my background is I work in state libraries and work with friends groups and libraries all over the state.
Marvelous, thank you. Okay.
I there's some Pine Ridge.
Okay. Marvelous.
We're a small branch, but your names.
Hey, I grew up in that general area of Lexington County. I know it well. I know Katie, but go ahead.
I'm Katie Watkins. I work with Richland Library as the volunteer coordinator and have been working with our friends group in our and was there with Richland Library from Richland Library Friends.
Yeah, understood. Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Brown, I'm the new president of the BL.
Batesburg, Leesville, right? Yep. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Helen Rivers, I'm the new secretary at Batesburg. Treasurer, excuse me.
Yeah, what is my job? I take care of the money. That's right. That's what I do.
That's it.
I have to check both.
Yes, ma'am, in the back.
Amy.
Yes. Oh, you've already gone.
I've already gone.
So yes, sir.
Mark Mancuso, I'm the senior branch librarian in the West Library. I'm the library liaison and a member of the Friends, and I do my best to spend.
Very good.
And I'm Brittany Gladden. I'm the director of the Lexington Maine Friends.
Okay.
And a great, well-established group. I got a table. I used to work for the Friends of the Lexington.
Very good. So we're looking at Lexington and Richland County here, basically. I love that the Richland County folks are on this side. It's like across the river, right there in the middle here, and there between shall meet. Reason I ask some of this is because different groups have different, let me take a step back. Different nonprofits can be in different stages of the cycle. And many nonprofits get started because a handful of people get together and say, hey, we should do a thing, right? Whatever that thing may be. Maybe it's helping feral cats. Maybe it is doing a cleanup of the roadside. Maybe it's, oh, I don't know, supporting the local library. But people get together and they say, hey, we should do a thing. And then it becomes a thing. And then it becomes a corporation. Right, and you may not be thinking to yourself, hey, we're a corporation, woo! Because when you think of corporation, you probably think of like ExxonMobil or Tesla or something like that. But no, nonprofit organizations, once they're incorporated, are corporations. And that requires a great deal of paperwork and hassle. And I'm not trying to discourage you from doing it or from having done it or keeping doing it, but you just have to know what's expected. And I asked this question about fully independent or integrated because I know the situation at Richland Library Friends and Foundation, and that's a very unique and interesting situation of, shall we say, deep cooperation versus what may be the case in other places. And so I wanted to recognize that different organizations are set up differently. And so the general scope of this presentation usually goes, because the point of this is usually to discourage folks from starting new nonprofits. I'll just get that out in the air right now. We have so many nonprofits. There are almost 30,000 nonprofit organizations in South Carolina at this point. Now, let's be fair, about 5,000 of them are chapters of the Wild Turkey Federation. Every single chapter of the National Wild Turkey Federation in the entire country is incorporated separately at the same address in Edgefield County, South Carolina. No, it's true. And it's because that's where their national headquarters are. I don't know why they decided to do it that way because that's so much paperwork. But you know, that's on them. That's not my problem. But so the numbers are a little wonky. Now, $30,000, 30,000 organizations, those are tax exempt organizations. You take out the wild turkeys, you take out the non-501c3s, we get it down to about 20,000. You take out all the organizations that have annual revenues less than $50,000, and we're down to about 5,000. So you see, and this is not knocking organizations with less than $50,000 worth of revenue, because they're the ones doing a lot of the work in the local communities. But you see that when we say, oh, we have all these nonprofits, not all of them are in the same stage of the process, right? And so what that means is sort of what the needs are, what the requirements are a little bit different depending on where you are in that process. So we want people to understand what they're getting into when they get into starting a new nonprofit, or indeed getting into working with and running a volunteer-based nonprofit organization. So we try to get folks to assess their readiness, make sure they're really ready to take this on, and then understanding what the steps are, not just to creating a new nonprofit organization, but to maintaining one. Because you may say to yourself, the paperwork is the hard part. Once I get the paperwork done, I'm good to go. Well, I have news for you. The paperwork is the easy part. And there's always going to be paperwork every single year. It's really the heavy lifting at the end of the maintaining, of keeping the board engaged, keeping your bylaws up to date, making sure you're obeying them, doing the fundraising and all of that stuff. That's the hard part. And so we'll focus a little bit more on that. So I'm gonna, like I said, I'm gonna skip over some of these things. One point I would make though is the considering of alternatives. And so some of you may be saying, hey, we have a friends group here, but this branch over here doesn't. What should we do? There are many different ways to accomplish this. You don't have to go out and start a new group just off the bat, just because you think you have to. What we always encourage folks to do is to test the waters, to see, is there enough will amongst the community to justify creating a new organization? Can we start with a small fundraiser? You keep it low, you keep it under a certain threshold. You don't, the state government's reporting requirements don't really care that much. Now, let me just stop right there. You saw some alphabet after my name. None of that alphabet was JD, okay? I am not a lawyer. I am not authorized to give legal advice. Anything I say is just my professional opinion as a social worker, and I'm not a lawyer, so don't take me to court, okay? But under certain thresholds, the Secretary of State's office, the Department of Revenue, they don't have the time or energy to try to chase you down and get paperwork out of you. And so it's a great way for you to test the waters and say, hey, if I just call a meeting together and we have a spaghetti dinner and say, hey, we're going to try to raise, oh, I don't know, $1,000 for a project for our library. Will people come? Will they buy tickets? Will they participate? You know, test the waters to see, you know, how much public support you can actually get. And if you get it, if you exceed it, then hey, maybe there's something in it, right? Can you work with another nonprofit organization, right? It seems like, at least in the Lexington side, each branch kind of has its own separate groups. Is that how it's going? You know, is there opportunity for collaboration among those different groups? Or maybe they just really want to deal with their own branch and that's it. That's okay. That's okay. But maybe there's opportunity for collaboration, right? Now I know the library kind of has to be a little bit hands off, and so certain things can't really run through the library, but are there other organizations that can serve as fiscal sponsors, so on and so forth? So that's just, and consider national resources, right? Consider Friends of South Carolina Libraries. I found there's a national Friends of the Libraries groups, right? And so you've got options and resources and information out there to help. So the regulatory steps here. I'll run through this really quickly because I imagine y'all have already done all of this. But just a refresher, it all starts with that social security number. I'm sorry, employer ID number. Now you can see why I might get them confused. Because an employer ID number, you may say, hey, we're not actually employing anything. This is a volunteer run group here. But then it's called an employer ID number. It is essentially the social security number for a corporation, right? People have social security numbers. Corporations are people too. They have employer ID numbers. And so the very, very, very first thing anyone has to do in starting a new nonprofit organization is to file for an employer ID number. And it's really easy, it's free. If somebody tries to charge you to do it, they're just trying to shake you down, because you can go directly to the IRS, type in a few things, basic information, and the magic machine spits out a number right then and there. And you're gonna want to keep that number in some file for the rest of the corporation's existence, because that is your number. And you'll have to reference it for every kind of filing you ever do, bank accounts, grants, often from foundations that want to know your EIN. They'll want to check your profile on GuideStar and they'll search you by your EIN number. Very important thing to have. And then once you've got that, then you file articles of incorporation with the Secretary of State's office here in South Carolina. Very simple form. They ask you some complex questions that you do need to think very deeply about, and we'll talk about that in a second. But it's 25 bucks. You can file it online now. You don't have to do the paper form. They finally caught up to the modern day over at the Secretary of State's office. And so you can even pay online. Some of the things that they ask you on this form is, what's the name of the organization? When people come to me and they're like, oh, I want to start a new nonprofit, I've already thought of an excellent name for it. That's about usually as far as they've gotten, by the way. But they want to know the name. They want to know the address that they can send mail to. They want to know the name of the person, the registered agent, whom they can address that mail to. Now, here's an important thing. For volunteer-run organizations, that registered agent probably changes frequently, and it's probably not always updated. Secretary of State's office. There is a form called the change of registered agent form. And anytime you change that registered agent, you need to change that form. I'll say a little bit later, there's probably some benefits in having at least one office on the board have a little bit more longevity than some of the others, so that that person can just, you won't have to change the registered agent quite as often, keep a little bit of institutional memory, number of advantages there. Sometimes it's the treasurer, sometimes it's the secretary who plays that role. Registered agent has to sign the initial form. They also have to sign the form changing it. Now here's the big deal. Here's where folks can get in trouble when they fill out this form, and if they do it wrong, then they gotta go through a whole rigmarole to fix it. Check A, B, or C, whichever is applicable. Check only one box. Is this a public benefit corporation? Is this a religious corporation? Is this a mutual benefit corporation? Now, 99 times out of 100, we're talking about public benefit corporations. If you're seeking 501c3, public charity status, we're talking about a public benefit corporation. However, nonprofits and folks come to me from time to time and they say, oh, well, but we're affiliated with our church. Doesn't that make us a religious organization? Well, you're only a religious organization if you are a church or some other house of worship. That's it. That's all we're really talking about in a religious corporation. If you're, then some people may say, well, we're going to have members. Are we a mutual benefit? We're here to help each other. Are we a mutual benefit corporation? Probably not. Mutual benefit corporation is usually like a multiple employer welfare arrangement, health insurance plan, retirement plan kind of situation. We're not talking about that. The first option is most likely the one you're going to select, right? Question 4 is the other one that gets people in trouble. This corporation will have members. This corporation will not have members. Now, I would encourage you all to check and see if you can find your form, see which one you select. Because based on which one was selected then, there are certain rules and procedures you need to follow every year. If you say the corporation will have members, what this means is you have voting members. You have dues paying members who have the right to vote for the board of directors, and they have the right to make certain decisions or participate in certain decisions about the corporation. And so if you've got a situation where you've got members, dues paying members, and you're not doing anything with them, and you have the board selecting its own people every year and not engaging the members in that decision, you're setting yourself up for trouble. However, if you've selected this corporation will not have members, you don't have to worry about any of that. And if you say, hey, but we do have members, but we don't want them to vote, that's okay. I am a proud member of the ETV endowment. I am a sustaining star. I don't get to vote for your board, right? So there's a distinction to be made here amongst legal members of the corporation versus members who are regular donors. And we sometimes call them members because it helps them feel better about it. That's okay. You just need to be careful about that distinction. Please.
So the foundation, then when they filled out this form, they put that they were not going to have members. They still solicited your board, but they just put they not going to have members. They're not going to.
That's right.
Okay, no, that's a really good distinction.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I mean, because they did that in the setting it up, right? They can still say, oh, such and such and so and so, we have these members, our sustaining stars. Anyone who pays $10 a month, you know, is a member, but they're not really a member. We're just gonna call them that for fundraising purposes. Hey, I get my sticker every year. I'm happy. I don't want anything else. I just want to listen to the radio and not feel guilty during the pledge drive. Okay. So the address of the principal office is usually the same as the registered agent. Now, here's some other things. This is what I like to call the last will and testament of the organization. This is the question that says, hey, if something goes sideways and the corporation dissolves and you've got like $5 left over, what happens to that $5? If you select the first checkbox here, then there's a whole complicated process in which the Court of Common Pleas decides, and it's probably not worth their time or yours to bother with it. You really want to select that second box to say, here's the name of the organization we want to get whatever assets we have left over. You can change it at any time, should there be a falling out with this other organization. But it's better to make that decision yourselves rather than to have the courts make it for you because they don't know anything about the story. And that this question 7 doesn't apply because it's only for mutual benefit corporations. We're good there. You can opt to put in other things into your articles of incorporation. You don't necessarily need to do that. And the incorporators get to sign. These are the people who are going to call themselves founders. Guess what? If you're a founder, it doesn't mean a darn thing. Not one thing. Doesn't mean legally nothing. It is a legally meaningless term, but people feel good about calling themselves founders, and you should respect the people who are the founders of the organization, but it doesn't mean anything legally. And then, of course, the original board members sign the form as well. So all of this is to say, do you have a copy of your original articles of incorporation? Have you looked at it? What does it say? Does it need an update? You can update it. There's a form called, and I think it's a silly name, the Articles of Amendment, which really ought to be called Amendment to the Articles of Incorporation, but whatever, it's not my job. But you can file articles of amendment to update your articles of incorporation. I think it's also $25. So we've looked at the articles of incorporation. What's next? Charitable registration in South Carolina, because I kid you not, it's 2 separate offices in the Secretary of State's office that deal with these things. The Corporations and Business Filings Office is where you would file the articles of incorporation. But they don't tell due diddly to the Public Charities Office, which is the office that regulates public charities. And so you've got to file with the Public Charities Office too. Now, let me tell you, let the Public Charities Office find out that you have been asking people for money and you haven't filed with them. They will send you a lovely letter to the tune of, you naughty person, you've been asking people for money and you didn't run it through us first. If you don't file your paperwork, we're going to charge you a $10,000 fine. Now listen, they don't want the $10,000. Well, I'm sure they might want the $10,000, but they're going to have to take you to court to get it. And the general counsel at the Secretary of State's office has better things to do than to take small nonprofits to court to get money out of them that they don't have. They really just want your paperwork. And I will tell every nonprofit leader who wants to hear, if you get that nasty gram from the Public Charities Office, call them immediately. Get it sorted. Get it handled. The absolute worst thing you can do is ignore it, because eventually they're going to get frustrated with you enough that they will take you to court just to make a point. And if they have to spend the money to take you to court to get money from you that you don't have, oh boy, it's not going to be a great day for anyone. So file the form, $50. And hey, look, if you're under a certain revenue threshold, and it's complicated, but it's possible. If you're under a certain revenue threshold, you don't even have to pay the fee. You just file the form. But you've got to file this every single year. And generally it's within 4.5 months after the close of your fiscal year. So if your fiscal year ends in June, then you got to file it by November 15th. If it's in December, you got to file it by May 15th. I did that math right? Something like that. Okay. Oh God, yes, this is what I'm talking about, the exception. This is a wall of text, don't read it. You can find it online. The important thing is that if you're a charitable organization which does not intend to solicit or receive contributions from the public in excess of $20,000 a year. Oh God, did I touch it? Oh, it's a magic screen. Oh, that's fancy. I've never had anything like that before. Okay. That's cool. $20,000 and you're tax exempt from the IRS, and nobody is compensated more than $500 a year. That probably applies to a lot of our friends groups, right? Not really raising a whole lot of money, just enough to be helpful. And then you don't have to file, you can file the exemption form and you don't have to pay the $50. Even regardless of how your fundraising is done, if you're below 7,500, you can file the exemption form as well. So that's the state kept happy. Hard to do, I know. Now we're going to talk about federal government, right? Because Section 501c3 is the law of the federal law that says, hey, these kinds of corporations are exempt from federal income tax. And you don't get that exemption unless you get it from the IRS. And generally, state governments will not grant that exemption on the state level unless you get it from the IRS as well. They don't want to do their own work to check up on you. They'll just let the IRS say it's okay. But the rule here for 501c3, which is the most advantageous tax exempt status out of all 27 or 8 of them now, is that it has to be charitable, religious, educational, scientific, literary, one that tests for public safety, fostering amateur sports competition, or working to prevent cruelty to children or animals. We just lump that all into the heading of charitable, right? Because that's a mouthful and nobody got time or energy to say it all like I just did. One thing to keep in mind is that such an organization cannot have a substantial part of its activities include attempts to influence legislation or participate for or against a candidate for public office, right? It's a very important rule. This is called the Johnson Amendment. And now, friends of library groups, y'all probably are not going to be getting too involved in matters of public policy, right? Unless they come for the libraries, right? And I won't get into details about what that means because I'm sure y'all know and I know and don't need to go into that. But there may be select opportunities where you feel the need to exercise your voice. You can do that and it will be okay. It just cannot be a substantial portion of your activities. Now, there are ways to measure that. The simplest explanation I can give you is that it comes out to something like 20% of your expenses. As long as you don't spend more than around 20% of your expenses on attempts to influence public policy, you're fine. It's actually a lot more complicated than that, and it's a whole stepwise tiered system. But if you're getting to that point, you can hire legal counsel who can help you figure it out. For the most part, the occasional standing in front of county council and berating them for their interference, that's okay. That's fine. But you absolutely under no circumstances cannot, from the organization, endorse or oppose a political candidate or party. So you cannot say, the Friends of Batesburg Leesville Branch Library endorses County Councilman da-di-da-di-da because he's a friend of the library. You cannot do that. You will lose your tax exemption. You will get in a lot of trouble. Don't do that. You can, as individuals, do whatever you want. This does not abrogate your free speech rights under the Constitution. The organization cannot do it. And of course, the assets of the organization has to be permanently dedicated to the exempt purpose. And I go through this fight with people starting nonprofits all the time because they're like, well, I want to do this as a side part of my business, and I want to create the nonprofit who can then hire my business to do that. That is so illegal, it's not even funny. Like, that is a quick trip to jail. And I hate it for folks who want to like do good and they have a good heart for it, but they also want to have some kind of return on their investment, right? They pour a lot of their personal assets and their personal money into it, and then they want to try to take it back out. They can't. A nonprofit organization is like a black hole when it comes to money. You put the money in and you never get it back. Because the assets are permanently dedicated. They can only be spent to further that purpose. And that includes administrative expenses, of course. But that does not include just giving money to people for no good reason whatsoever. And so you've got to be careful about that sort of thing. So the form that is filed is Form 1023, the application for recognition of tax exempt status under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. Yeah, I got that right. See if you can get your hands on an original copy of that for your organization. It'll be very informative. Now, a couple of years ago, they created Form 1023-EZ. Is that on my next slide? Yes, yes it is. So the old form, which if you're getting started and you already have a whole bunch of money, which is very rare, but it does happen, you still have to file the big old form. But most folks nowadays who are starting from nothing, they can file Form 1023-EZ, 3-page online form, and it's only $275 to file, or at least it was the last time I checked. But see if you can lay your hands on a copy of that form, because it will be informative about what the folks were thinking when they first started this. Yeah. So then other filings, I don't think many of these will, well, hold the phone. Okay, so property tax exemption, you're probably not gonna have to worry about. Sales tax exemption, the book sale. Oh, the book sale, right? You can get a sales tax exemption from the Department of Revenue for the book sales. It's a form you have to fill out. Great stuff. If you're gonna hold a raffle, a charitable raffle, those are legal now. We got the Constitution changed to allow it. You can file that form, and you've got to do some more paperwork with the Secretary of State's office. But you can do that. Another thing I'm thinking about, it was in my brain just a second ago, and it's flown out, that might apply to y'all. Sales tax exemption, raffle registration. There's something else that is unique about Friends of Library Groups. It's gone from me. Oh, if you hold events, if you hold an event, like a dinner, or a gala party, and you've got, well, on the Richland County side, if you've got alcohol at the event, Lexington County, they don't drink. But if you've got an event where alcohol is being served, there are some permits that you need to get from the Department of Revenue, particularly if any alcoholic products are being donated. There's a whole process that has to be followed. I had to do it for our annual conference last year, and it had me sitting in the Department of Revenue for like 3 hours waiting on the form to get signed. Lots of fun. But just bear that in mind. If you're having a special event, you're going to have booze, you've got to fill out more forms. Here's what's got to be done every single year. Got to file a tax return. And you may say, Ben, we're tax exempt. Why do we gotta file a tax return? Well, it's an information return, right? The government's got to know that you're actually spending the money that you're raising on what you're supposed to be spending it on, and not on silly things. So Form 990 is the form that nonprofit organizations file. Now, good news, if your gross receipts, if your annual receipts in a given year are less than $50,000, then you file what's called the 990N. It's e-postcard, and it's online, and it doesn't ask for any financial information, because the IRS does not want to take the time to comb through that. They just want to know that you're still a going concern and that you still exist. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. And they want your contact information just in case they do need to get a hold of you. Very easy to do. It's online. It's on the IRS website. It is free. Do not be fooled by people trying to say, oh, we'll charge you only $100. We'll file your 990N for you. You don't need that. They just see you as a money printer. Don't fall for it. It is a very easy form to fill out online. It takes 10 minutes tops. But if you're over that 50K mark, then you're getting into 990 EZ territory, which is a real form. And it does take a little bit more time, but it's not as complicated as if you had over $200,000 in annual revenue. And what a glorious day that'll be. In which case you'll have to file the full Form 990. But good news, if you've got that much revenue, you can hire an accountant to do it for you. And did I mention that charitable registration form? You got to fill that out every year, $50. And with that charitable registration form, they want your 990. Right? So it kind of goes round in circles here. If you are filing the exemption, you don't have to supply the financial information, right? Because you're below the threshold where you file the 990 in, it's a complicated thing, whatever. But there is a weird threshold between $25,000 and $50,000 where you file the Form 990N with no financial information, but the Secretary of State's office still wants financial information. What do you do? Well, the Secretary of State's office has a financial information form that they would like for you to fill out in lieu of the 990. So if you're in between 25 and 50, I'm sorry, there is more paperwork, but not too much. So just to recap here, because this is complicated, right? You got to go back and forth between the state and federal government. You got to get an EIN from the IRS. You got to incorporate with the business filings division. You got to file the Form 1023 with the IRS. You got to get the charitable registration or exemption with the charities division. Back and forth, back and forth. But then you're done until next year. Then the heavy lifting begins. You've got to have a board of directors. How many board members does your friends group board have? Show of hands, we got 5, 4, 5, 12. That's a good number. Yeah, okay. Friends and Family Foundation. Friends and Foundation of Richland Library. How many board members do y'all have? No idea. Okay. I think that's right. I've seen it on the website. So that's good. That's good. 4 is a little small, but it might work for you. But you have to have a board, right? You can't not have a board of directors. The board of directors are the trustees of the corporation, right? Unlike a corporate board where they are major shareholders and they're getting a big old paycheck from sitting on that board. That's not happening on a nonprofit board. You're not shareholders, you're not getting a big old paycheck, and but you're fulfilling the same duties and obligations, right? When you were sitting in that board meeting for the Friends of the Library, you are fulfilling the same duties and obligations as the board of Berkshire Hathaway, right? The same laws around responsibility and ethics apply to you as it applies to Warren Buffett. And that's the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, right? But in the case of a nonprofit, no one owns it. It doesn't have an owner or a group of owners in the same sense as Berkshire Hathaway, right? So, and not even the founder. When founders of nonprofits say, I own a nonprofit, I'm like, no, you don't. You don't own it. It owns you, if anything. And so we have to keep this in mind. Your trustees, your stewards, you are guarding a public trust in this organization. And so because there's that tax exempt status, because donors can write this off their federal income taxes, I mean, $51 billion a year, and I pulled that number a couple of years ago. $51 billion a year, the federal government does not receive in money because of 501c3 organizations, because of their tax exemption, because of the tax deductibility from personal income taxes. $51 billion a year. Now, is that going to make a crack in the national debt? Probably not. Well, it's a pretty big crack, actually. And so, you know, that's not something to laugh about. So here's the rules. You got to have at least 3 board members. I say 7 is a better absolute minimum because 3 people can get together and agree on things and make bad decisions. If you've got a little bit larger number, then at least somebody can say, hey, that's a bad decision. And let's talk about that a little more before we analyze it. Okay, I need to keep moving. 11 may be getting a little bit too much. There's one nonprofit that has a 55-member board. I don't recommend it. That's not a board, that's a Congress. One of the big duties of a board is hiring and firing executive director. When you get to that point, glory, hallelujah. But board members have to understand what their legal and financial responsibilities are. You are on the hook if you're on the board, right? And so when you're looking for board members, you're looking for who should be on this board. You really want to consider the skills and the relationships that those persons have. And the relationships is a big part of the puzzle here, because these need to be people who can call people and say, hey, I want to get you involved in the Friends. I want to get you involved in the library. And by involved, I'm asking you for money. So consider when you're asking people to serve on the board, what can they bring to the table that can help your organization? So big responsibility. Boards need to clarify in writing what the vision, the mission, and the core values of the organization are. This is a part of strategic planning. Those of us who work in nonprofit staff probably heard this over and over and over again. But it's important because these statements are the guideposts for how the organization does its work. These are like the fence that keeps the horse in the field, right? With a good vision and a good mission statement, and good core values, we can sort of draw the line around where our work is in the space that we inhabit. I've given you Together SCs as an example, but essentially the vision statement says, hey, this is what we want to see the world look like because of our work. The mission statement is how are we doing it? And our core values are a bit more detail on how we're doing it, but also how we're not doing it, right? And so if you don't have those statements well articulated, the board's job to do that. And then we get to the bylaws, okay? The bylaws, now people may say, oh, but we have a constitution and we have bylaws. There was a time when those were separate things and that was okay. Nowadays, the bylaws is the constitution. So if you have a separate constitution and bylaws, you can probably take some effort and merge them together into a single document. Because for all intents and purposes nowadays, bylaws are the constitution of the organization. But their main purpose is to govern the internal management. They are the general rule of the organization. And so they speak more about how the board of directors operates and how they're chosen and what are the guideposts and rules for the board, more than they talk about almost anything else. Because once the board is in place and the board knows what their guideposts are, the board can then determine the rest of the process. Now, in voluntary organizations, it's a lot easier to just keep everything in the bylaws. So that's okay. Once an organization gets to a certain point where it's a bit larger, then you might want to separate that stuff out. This is where the case method can apply, the copy and steal everything method. There are so many different kinds of bylaws out there and they all look pretty much the same. If you need an update on your bylaws, let me know. I can get you a template spelling out the basics. But if you do use samples or you borrow from others, just consider reading it through completely and making sure that everything's in there actually applies to your organization before you adopt them. And you may want to just kind of cut out the things that don't really need to apply. So when it comes to fundraising, right, you've got to be able to ask people to give money. I have a problem with this. They just added, my boss is retiring, she added fundraising to my responsibilities on top of other things. It makes me nervous. I don't like asking people for money. I'm getting better at it though. But you've got to be able to ask people for money, else what's the point, right? The purpose of Friends Groups is to raise money in order to do nice things at the library to help the people. And so what's really helpful in this is writing out a case for support. It can be a one-page document that says, here's who we are, here's what we're doing, and here's why it's important and why you should consider giving. And what does $20 do for this community, for the library? What does $50 do? What does $1,000 accomplish for the library? right? Articulating that out, writing it out, then you've got a flyer, you've got a sheet, you've got something you can walk into a meeting with a potential donor or funder and say, hey, let's have a conversation about you and the library and how you can help the library, right? And you can do a business plan, although business planning is a lot more complicated than strategic planning, all that stuff. If you can get to it, that's great, but really a case for support, keeping it simple. In fact, what I will say, oftentimes where strategic plans and business plans, and people will tell you, oh, you need to have these things, you need to have a strategic plan. People will get overcomplicated with them. They hire consultants, and I love consultants. I work with a lot of them, and they're very good at their jobs, and they can do really nice strategic plans for organizations that really need giant, enormous strategic plans. Volunteer organizations do not need giant strategic plans. You don't need complicated things. You don't need to spend your energy trying to do this whole planning process that you're so exhausted by it that you pat yourself on the back, put it on the shelf, and never look at it again. Moderately sized nonprofits fall for this trap all the time. Don't put too much energy into the strategic plan than you need to. The strategic plan can be as simple as 5 goals, heck, 3 goals. 3 goals that we want to accomplish in the next 3 to 5 years. Done. Strategic plan. It's really that easy. It does not have to be more complicated than that. But that will help you in setting those guide rails, setting those guideposts for the activities that you're doing and what you're asking people to contribute to. So just a note on fundraising. People will say, oh, I'm going to start a nonprofit, I'm going to get grants. I'm going to get all kinds of grants from all kinds of foundations. Good luck with that. Because grants from foundations are 2.9% of the overall nonprofit funding pie. 2.9%, almost 3, right? You see corporate contributions, not even 1%. Bequests, 1.5%. Individual donations are 8.7% of the nonprofit pie. Now listen, this is skewed a little bit by what we call the eds and meds, the hospitals and the schools, the colleges. Still, this is pretty well in line. 31.8% government contracts, government grants and contracts. Government grants are so hard. But almost half of nonprofit revenue comes from fees for services. People will say to me, oh, our nonprofit, we can't charge. Well, you can absolutely charge. Absolutely, absolutely. And what do Friends of Libraries groups often do? Book sales, fees for services. You are charging them for a book, right? And they get to take that book home and feel good about that and feel good that they've contributed to the library in the process. And so it's okay. You can charge. It's how nonprofits make their money nowadays. So this will apply to organizations that are sort of aiming towards hiring professional staff someday. Still, it's important. You want to set up strong systems in your organization. You want to have some accountability for that treasurer who has the checkbook. You don't want that treasurer to be in the awkward position of being the only one who ever looks at the money, right? You want them to have some support. You want them to have some accountability so that nobody can say, you know what, she's got that checkbook and she's looking at the bank statement and nobody else is, and you don't want anyone ever to say that about her. So make sure that there are at least 2 other people who are supporting and doing the bank reconciliations and managing the finances. If you don't have a finance committee, have a finance committee, even if it's the whole dang board meeting separately to do the finance stuff and be the finance committee. It's okay. But you need to have that support. You need to make sure you've got good systems in place for the financial management. Because all it will take is somebody to come along and start asking awkward questions. And if you can't answer those awkward questions, it only becomes more awkward. And so setting up good accounting systems, there are software that's very cheap or free for accounting. out there. Go to TechSoup.org and you can find them. Having good financial policies for internal controls are important. Having good insurance coverage, particularly directors and officers insurance. I like to call it bad decision insurance. You're probably not likely to be sued, right? But some people are litigious. The important thing about directors and officers insurance is that it will defend you in the event of a kind of lawsuit that arises from a board decision. And once you start, if you start filing that Form 990, a serious Form 990, it's going to ask you, do you have a whistleblower policy? Do you have a conflict of interest policy? Do you have, it'll ask you a whole bunch of policies. You need to make sure that you have those policies in place by that time. Conflict of interest policy, I think, is particularly important because that goes to the core duties of board members in being loyal to the organization. If you have a conflict of interest, hard to be loyal to the organization, you need to disclose those conflicts of interest. Some keys to success here. Having it says strong relationship between board and chief executive here, but listen, in y'all's case, it's a strong relationship between y'all and your host library, right? The library that you're supporting, you need to have good relationships with them. You need to have ongoing and honest communication with them. You know, the board being in full participation in fundraising, the board fulfilling its governing and fiduciary roles, communication with the community. Now listen, funding is important. Money is important to make our work happen, right? But that's not the most important currency for a nonprofit organization. The most important currency for a nonprofit organization is trust. Because if your community does not trust you, they will not give and they will not participate and you will not be able to do anything. And so you must guard that trust. You must guard your organization's branding in that sense, very jealously. Evaluating your programs, very important. And then Together SC, of course, has guiding principles and best practices. So we publish this. It is not really a one-size-fits-all document. I would say if you take a look at it, don't try to bite off the whole thing at once. Take it a little step at a time. Accomplish a thing here and there to bring yourself into alignment. Some other helpful resources from us. Together SC, we publish For Good Connections every other Tuesday. All the things you want to know and some of the things you don't about what's going on in the nonprofit sector. You can get that in your inbox every other Tuesday. IRS regulations, Secretary of State's regulations. Our national organization, National Council of Nonprofits, has some great information as well. We've also got some fundraising resources. Hey, look, it's the state library on there, right? See, you have the benefit in that many libraries are also Foundation Center. Well, they're called Candid now, but you know, they have access to Candid, which means there's access to potential grants and things like that through the Foundation Center. And I'll make sure this presentation gets sent out just so you don't have to worry about all this. So good books to read. Toxic Charity is a particularly good one. Sort of how nonprofits do their best to do good and still sometimes don't quite get it right. Fired Up Fundraising is a really good book by Gail Perry that can help boards in doing fundraising and such. So all of that is to say, I am way over time and I am so sorry. I'm Ben Bullock. Together SC is your statewide network for charitable and philanthropic organizations. Membership in Together SC is very affordable, and we are here to help you do your jobs better. Any questions? Please ask.
Some of the friends groups are 501c4, and I think that is the correct number that some of them are. And I wondered why. And what they should do about it.
Yeah.
If they want to switch to the 501c3, which I would think would be preferable.
Right. So yeah, there are 28 different 501c type organizations. 75% of them are 501c3s because only 501c3s can confer tax deductibility onto your donors. If you donate to a C4, you don't get the right to deduct your taxes. C4s are generally they're called social welfare organizations, but what they really mean is political organizations. They're organizations that they are allowed, 501c4s, they're allowed to do endorsements of political candidates and things like that. In order to change that, if you want to be a charitable organization, you would need to file the Form 1023 and ask the IRS to review and classify all as 501c3. Yeah, that would be for you. And then you can register as a public charity, as Secretary of State, things like that. Other questions? Thank you all for your forbearance and letting me go over time.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, we'll take a quick 5-minute break and then we'll get started back with our next speaker from SE Committee.
Was that helpful? Was it good? Oh, let her stop the recording.